The sky does not darken here, not fully, not in the way we understand darkness. Picture the Arctic Ocean in midsummer, a twilight that stretches endlessly across the horizon, where the sun refuses to set, circling the dome of heaven like a watchful god. The ice below glows pale blue, ancient and still. The wind carries no sound but its own breath. There are no roads here, no ruins visible to the naked eye, only the silent testimony of snow, sea, and sky. But beneath this frozen stillness, something whispers. It is a whisper older than empires, older than the pyramids, older perhaps than memory itself. It speaks of a time when this barren wilderness was not barren at all, when warmth kissed these latitudes, when rivers flowed where glaciers now sleep, and when a people, perhaps the first people, walked beneath the sun that never abandoned them. The ancient Greeks had a name for this place. They called it Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind, the realm of eternal light. To them, it was not merely a location on a map. It was a paradise, a golden age made geography, a memory encoded in myth. But was it only myth? Modern science tells us the poles were uninhabitable during the epochs when civilization is said to have begun. Ice and darkness ruled. Survival was impossible. And yet the stories persist. Across cultures, across millennia, the same strange tale resurfaces of a luminous land at the top of the world, where time moved differently, where death held no dominion, where the sun never set. What if the ancients were not inventing a fantasy, but remembering a truth? What if Hyperborea was real, not as they imagined it, but as something far stranger? A chapter of human history, buried beneath miles of ice, erased by climate, forgotten by time, preserved only in fragments of myth and the stubborn poetry of those who refused to let it die. This is the question we carry into the silent north, not with certainty, not with answers, but with the quiet conviction that some mysteries are worth pursuing, even if they lead us to the edge of the known world, and beyond. The camera rises. The ice stretches endlessly, and somewhere beneath it, perhaps, lies the truth. Long before satellites mapped the frozen crown of the planet, long before explorers braved the killing cold in search of passages and glory, the poets spoke of Hyperborea. Herodotus, the father of history, wrote of it in the 5th century BCE, though even then he admitted uncertainty. He recorded the accounts of others, travelers and storytellers, who claimed that far to the north, beyond the lands of the Scythians, beyond the reach of mortal conflict, there existed a people blessed by Apollo himself. They lived, it was said, for 1,000 years. They knew neither disease nor old age. War was foreign to them. Winter never came. Pindar, the lyric poet, went further. He described Hyperborea as a place where sacred processions honored the god of light, where music filled the air perpetually, and where the sun blazed without pause. It was not a land of struggle, but of transcendence. A world where humanity had outgrown suffering. These were not idle fantasies. The Greeks did not treat Hyperborea as fiction. It appeared in their religious rites. Delos, the sacred island birthplace of Apollo, was said to receive offerings from the Hyperboreans, mysterious gifts wrapped in wheat straw, carried by veiled maidens across vast and perilous distances. The gifts arrived generation after generation, though no one could say for certain who sent them or from where they truly came. To the Greek imagination, Hyperborea was both distant and intimate, a mirror held up to their own world, reflecting what humanity might become if freed from the weight of fate. It was Edenic, yes, but not soft. It was a paradise earned, not given. A place where discipline and devotion had lifted a people beyond the ordinary cycles of birth and death. But woven into these golden tales were fragments of something more concrete, descriptions of endless daylight, accounts of frozen seas, references to mountains of ice and rivers that flowed in strange, unnatural rhythms. These were not the inventions of poets who had never left the Mediterranean. These were details smuggled into myth from the accounts of those who had ventured north, sailors, traders, exiles, and returned with stories too strange to be believed, yet too specific to be ignored. Somewhere in the marriage of poetry and geography, Hyperborea took shape, not entirely real, not entirely imagined, a place balanced on the edge of the world and the edge of possibility. To understand Hyperborea, one must first understand the ancient struggle to comprehend the North. For the Greeks and Romans, the world was a knowable thing, bounded by the pillars of Hercules to the west, the sands of Arabia to the east, and the mysterious, frozen expanse to the north. But the North resisted understanding. It was a place where the rules of navigation broke down, where the stars behaved strangely, and where even the sun seemed to forget its course. Imagine the first Mediterranean sailors who ventured beyond the familiar coasts of Gaul and Britannia. They had no compasses, no concept of magnetic poles, no way to reconcile the behavior of the heavens as they sailed further into the long twilight of northern summers. The sun, which should have set, lingered. The horizon stretched in ways that defied their geometry. The seas, they reported, thickened. Some claimed the water itself turned to a kind of slush, neither liquid nor solid, that clung to the hulls of ships like living breath. Pytheas of Massalia, the great Greek explorer of the 4th century BCE, sailed north and returned with tales that baffled his contemporaries. He spoke of a land called Thule, 6 days' sail beyond Britain, where the sun barely set in summer, and where the ocean congealed into something he could neither walk upon nor sail through. His accounts were dismissed by many as exaggeration, even lies. But modern scholars now believe Pytheas may have reached Iceland, or perhaps even the edge of the Arctic ice shelf. What Pytheas encountered was not myth. It was the physical reality of a world his culture had no framework to interpret. The phenomenon of the midnight sun, commonplace above the Arctic Circle, must have seemed divine, miraculous, impossible. To a people raised under the dependable rhythm of day and night, the idea of a sun that refused to set was not merely strange. It was cosmological. And so the North became not just geography, but theology, a place where the laws of nature bent, where gods walked more freely than men, where time itself seemed suspended. This confusion, this collision of reality and perception, gave birth to legends far more durable than the maps that tried to contain them. Hyperborea emerged not from imagination alone, but from the edges of real experience, distorted by distance, time, and wonder into something eternal. The ancients could not explain what they had seen, so they named it paradise. Names are never accidental. They carry within them the weight of perception, the fingerprints of those who first spoke them into being. Boreas asterisk, the north wind. In Greek mythology, he was a god, fierce and cold, sweeping down from the distant mountains to bring winter's bite. His realm was the unknown, the harsh, the unforgiving. To go beyond Boreas, then, Hyperboreas asterisk, was to pass into a land that existed on the far side of hardship. Not merely north, but asterisk beyond asterisk north, past the threshold where the mortal world ended. But language is a living thing. It migrates, it transforms. And as the word Hyperborea traveled through centuries and cultures, it accumulated meanings never intended by its first speakers. To the Romans, it became synonymous with the barbarian north, Scythia, Germania, the wild steppes where civilization had not yet taken root. To medieval scholars, it was a vague and mystical geography, a placeholder for lands still unmapped. By the Renaissance, mapmakers had begun to speculate. Was Hyperborea Greenland? Iceland? Some lost archipelago swallowed by the polar ice? Linguistic drift is often dismissed as trivial, but in this case, it reveals something profound. The name Hyperborea was never a fixed point on a map. It was a concept, a way of describing the unreachable, the extreme, the edge of human endurance and imagination. It was both a place and a metaphor, shifting with the tides of exploration and myth. Consider the possibility that what the Greeks called Hyperborea, the Norse called something else entirely. That the indigenous peoples of the Arctic had their own names for homelands long predating Mediterranean contact. That the story of Hyperborea is not one story at all, but a dozen different memories, layered over millennia, each culture projecting its own longing onto the white silence of the North. In this sense, Hyperborea is not lost. It was never singular. It exists wherever human beings have looked toward the horizon and imagined a better, stranger world waiting just beyond reach. And perhaps that is the most enduring truth of all. There is a place on Earth where the sun does not set for months. Not metaphorically, not in poetry, literally. Above the Arctic Circle, during the height of summer, the sun traces a slow, lazy circle around the sky, never dipping below the horizon. Day and night lose meaning. Time becomes a continuum of pale gold light, stretching across tundra and ice. The human mind, evolved under the steady rhythm of day and night, struggles to adapt. Sleep becomes difficult. Dreams grow vivid, strange. The boundary between waking and sleeping blurs. And then, in winter, the opposite occurs. The sun vanishes. For months, darkness reigns, not the gentle darkness of a temperate night, but an absolute, crushing absence of light. The stars burn cold overhead. The auroras flicker like memories of a lost world. And life, what little remains, huddles in silence, waiting for the sun's return. This is not myth. This is physics. The tilt of the Earth's axis, combined with its orbit around the sun, creates these extremes. The further north one travels, the more pronounced they become. At the pole itself, there is one sunrise and one sunset per year. But to ancient peoples encountering this phenomenon for the first time, it must have seemed supernatural. How could the sun refuse to set? How could night stretch for months without end? In a world where the sun's daily journey was the most reliable constant in existence, the polar regions represented a fracture in the natural order, a place where the gods had written different rules. It is easy to see how such a place could birth stories of immortality. A sun that never sets becomes a symbol of eternity. A land bathed in perpetual light becomes a paradise untouched by time. The Greeks, hearing second-hand accounts of these phenomena, wove them into the myth of Hyperborea, a land where aging stopped, where death held no dominion, where the sun was not a visitor but a permanent resident. But there is a darker side to the midnight sun. Prolonged exposure to endless daylight can unsettle the human psyche. It disrupts circadian rhythms, induces insomnia, and in some cases, triggers hallucinations. Early explorers reported strange visions, feelings of disorientation, and an uncanny sense that time itself had become unreliable. Perhaps the stories of Hyperborea, as a land of transcendence and strangeness, are not contradictions, but two sides of the same truth. A place so extreme, so alien to human experience, that it could only be understood through myth. The sun circles, the ice watches, and beneath it all, the memory lingers. Not all knowledge of the North came through rumor and poetry. Some came through blood, salt, and sail. Pytheas of Massalia stands as one of history's most enigmatic figures, a Greek astronomer and navigator who, around 325 BCE, ventured beyond the known world. His original writings are lost, but fragments survived in the works of later historians. And from those fragments, a remarkable journey emerges. He sailed past the Pillars of Hercules, up the Atlantic coast, through the treacherous waters off Brittany and Britain, and onward to a place he called Toul, a land 6 days' sail north of Britain, where the summer sun barely set and the ocean became something neither solid nor liquid. He described it as a place where the sea, air, and land seemed to merge into a single gelatinous mass, a description that matches the phenomenon of pancake ice forming on the surface of polar waters. His contemporaries mocked him. Strabo, the Roman geographer, dismissed Pytheas as a liar, but modern scholars now believe Pytheas may have reached Iceland or even the edge of the Arctic ice sheet. His descriptions of the midnight sun, of the thickening seas, of the strange luminosity of the northern sky, all align too closely with reality to be dismissed as fabrication. Pytheas was not alone. The Phoenicians, those great seafarers of the ancient world, are believed to have ventured far into the northern Atlantic in search of tin and amber, resources abundant in the colder latitudes. Roman accounts mention traders who brought back strange goods from the frozen north. White furs, walrus ivory, amber so pale it seemed to glow from within. These were not myths. These were trade routes, supply chains, economic networks that stretched across thousands of miles, connecting the Mediterranean world to the Arctic fringe. And along those routes, stories traveled, tales of lands where the sun behaved strangely, where ice covered the sea, and where, perhaps, other peoples lived according to rhythms and customs the southern world could barely comprehend. What if the myth of Hyperborea was born from these encounters? Not from fantasy, but from the imperfect transmission of real experiences, filtered through language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and the inevitable distortions of oral tradition? The explorers returned. Their ships carried not just goods, but fragments of a world that existed beyond the edge of the known. And from those fragments, the poets built paradise. The snow falls slowly here, not in a storm, but in silence, flake by flake, accumulating across centuries, burying the land beneath layer upon layer of crystalline stillness. Ice, we think, is sterile, a blank page, but it is not. Ice is memory. Each layer preserves a moment in time, a summer of warmth, a winter of cold, a volcanic eruption half a world away. Trapped within the ice are bubbles of ancient air, pollen from long-extinct plants, and dust carried on winds that blew before the first cities rose. In Greenland, scientists have drilled cores more than 2 miles deep, extracting ice that fell as snow 130,000 years ago. In Antarctica, the record stretches back nearly 1 million years. These cores tell stories of a planet in constant flux, of ice ages and warm periods, of forests that once grew where now there is only frost, and of climates so different from our own that they seem almost alien. But the ice holds more than scientific data. It holds silence, the kind of silence that makes you wonder what has been forgotten, what has been covered, what perhaps is waiting to be found. Consider this. During the mid-Holocene, roughly 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, the Arctic was significantly warmer than it is today. Tree lines extended hundreds of miles further north. Rivers that are now frozen solid flowed freely. The ice sheets that now dominate Greenland and the Canadian Arctic were smaller, thinner, more fragile. It was a brief window, geologically speaking, when the North was not the barren wasteland of modern imagination, but a living, breathing place. A place where humans could, theoretically, have lived and thrived. What if they did? What if during that warm interlude, while Sumerians were building cities in Mesopotamia and Egyptians were raising stones along the Nile, others were moving north, following game, seeking new lands drawn by the strange beauty of a sun that never set? What if Hyperborea is not a myth at all, but a memory, imperfect, distorted, but rooted in a time when the Arctic was not impossible? The snow continues to fall, the ice thickens, and beneath it, perhaps, something waits. The term is precise, clinical, the Holocene climate optimum. Between roughly 9,000 and 5,000 years ago, Earth experienced a prolonged period of warmth, temperatures several degrees higher than today, driven by orbital variations that brought the planet closer to the sun during northern summers. The effects were dramatic. In Scandinavia, forests of birch and pine expanded northward into regions now dominated by tundra. In Siberia, mammoths had already vanished, but their ecological successors, reindeer, musk oxen, woolly rhinoceros remnants, roamed landscapes far greener than the ice-locked barrens of the present. Glaciers retreated, coastlines shifted, rivers carved new paths through newly thawed ground. And in the Arctic, something remarkable happened. It became habitable. Palynological studies, the analysis of ancient pollen preserved in sediment cores, reveal that during the Holocene optimum, plant species we associate with temperate climates grew at latitudes we now consider polar. Spruce forests extended into northern Alaska. Grasslands covered much of Greenland's ice-free coast. Even in the high Canadian Arctic, evidence suggests seasonal vegetation that could have supported grazing herds and the humans who hunted them. This is not speculation. It is data. Hard, measurable, reproducible data. The Arctic was warmer for thousands of years. Now consider the timeline. The Holocene optimum overlaps precisely with the rise of early civilizations in the Near East and Mediterranean. Göbekli Tepe was being built. The first cities were emerging in Mesopotamia. Writing was being invented. And far to the north, beyond the reach of these nascent empires, the Arctic was experiencing its own quiet revolution. Could early seafarers, traders, explorers, exiles have reached these shores during this warm window? Could they have encountered peoples already living there, adapted to the long daylight and cold but survivable winters? Could those encounters, passed down through oral tradition, have become the seed of the Hyperborean myth? Mainstream archaeology is cautious. There is no direct evidence of Mediterranean contact with the Arctic during this period. No Greek pottery found on Greenland's shores. No inscriptions, no shipwrecks. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The Arctic is vast, remote, and poorly surveyed. Most of it remains buried beneath ice that has only recently begun to retreat. What lies beneath is still largely unknown. And so the question remains open, not answered, but suspended in the space between possibility and proof. The ice remembers, but it has not yet spoken. In 2001, a Russian-French archaeological team made a discovery that shattered assumptions about the limits of ancient human endurance. Deep within the Sakha Republic of Northern Siberia, along the banks of the Yana River, they uncovered a site dating back more than 0 years, far into the last ice age when glaciers dominated the northern hemisphere, and survival at such latitudes should have been impossible. Yet here, at 71 degrees north, well above the Arctic Circle, was evidence of human habitation. Not fleeting, not accidental, but sustained. The site, known as Yana RHS, contained thousands of tools, finely crafted stone blades, bone spear points, ivory needles used for stitching cold weather clothing. There were hearths carefully constructed, showing repeated use over long periods. There were ornaments, beads carved from mammoth ivory, polished and shaped with care that spoke not of desperation, but of culture. These were not primitive survivors clinging to existence. These were people who had mastered one of the harshest environments on the planet. They hunted woolly mammoths, rhinoceroses, and bison across the frozen steppes. They built shelters capable of withstanding months of darkness and temperatures far below freezing. They passed knowledge across generations: how to read the ice, how to track game in whiteout conditions, how to turn bone and stone into instruments of survival and art. And they did this 30,000 years ago, millennia before the Holocene, millennia before the supposed dawn of civilization in the Fertile Crescent. What does this mean for Hyperborea? It means that the idea of the Arctic as eternally uninhabitable is a modern misconception. Humans have lived at extreme northern latitudes for far longer and far more successfully than we once believed. The Yana River hunters prove that even during the depths of an ice age, the far north was not empty. It was home. If humans could thrive above the Arctic Circle 30,000 years ago, what might have been possible during the Holocene optimum, when the climate was warmer, the ice less oppressive, and the sun more generous? The artifacts lie in museums now, behind glass. But the questions they raise remain unanswered, suspended in the cold silence of the north, waiting for the ice to recede a little further. The gifts arrived every year, wrapped in straw. According to Herodotus, the sacred island of Delos, birthplace of Apollo, and one of the holiest sites in the Greek world, received mysterious offerings from the Hyperboreans. These gifts, he wrote, were carried by veiled maidens across vast distances, passing from tribe to tribe, relay style, until they finally reached the Aegean. The offerings were treated with reverence. They were placed in the temple of Artemis and honored in rituals that predated written memory. The Greeks did not know what they contained. They did not know who had sent them, but they knew the gifts were old, ancient, tied to something that existed before their own gods had names. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century CE, recorded similar accounts. He described how the Hyperboreans sent sacred sheaves of wheat, bound in straw, as a gesture of goodwill and devotion to Apollo. The gifts were accompanied by hymns, passed down orally, that spoke of a land where the sun never set and where music filled the air in endless celebration. To modern scholars, this sounds like mythological embellishment, poetic license meant to elevate the status of Delos. But there is a detail that gives pause: the route. The gifts, according to ancient sources, traveled overland, not by sea. They moved through Scythia, down through the Balkans, and eventually reached Greece. This matches, almost perfectly, the trade routes known to have existed during the Bronze and Iron Ages, routes that connected the Baltic amber trade, Siberian furs, and Nordic metals to the Mediterranean world. What if the Hyperborean gifts were not myth, but memory? What if they were real offerings from northern peoples, perhaps the ancestors of the Sami, or early Scandinavian tribes, or even more distant groups whose names have been lost to time? What if these peoples, living at the edge of the known world, sent tribute to the southern gods as a way of maintaining trade relations, or as part of a religious syncretism that bridged cultures across thousands of miles? The Greeks interpreted these gifts through the lens of their own mythology, transforming trade into divine mystery. But beneath the myth, there may have been a network, fragile, ancient, barely understood even by those who participated in it, linking the Arctic fringe to the heart of classical civilization. The straw-wrapped gifts are long gone, but the memory of their arrival lingers, encoded in ritual, in story, and in the strange insistence of the Greeks that somewhere, far beyond the north wind, there existed a people touched by the divine. Migration is written into the human genome. We are a species that moves. Out of Africa, across the Middle East, into Europe, Asia, the Americas. The story of humanity is the story of restless feet, of horizons pursued, of new lands claimed and adapted to. But one direction has always seemed impossible: north. Too cold, too dark, too barren. The poles, we were taught, were the final frontier, inhospitable, empty, beyond the reach of ancient peoples who lacked the technology to survive such extremes. But the evidence increasingly suggests otherwise. Genetic studies of indigenous Arctic populations, the Inuit, the Sami, the Nenets, the Chukchi, reveal deep ancestral roots stretching back thousands of years. These are not recent arrivals. These are peoples whose lineages have adapted to the Arctic over countless generations. Their DNA, encoding strategies for metabolizing fat, for tolerating cold, for thriving in environments that would kill most humans within hours. And the archaeological record is beginning to fill in the gaps. Sites like Yana River, Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, where human presence dates back 24,000 years. The discovery of ancient stone tools on the new Siberian islands, far above the Arctic Circle, where no humans were supposed to have ventured during the Ice Age. These findings challenge the dominant narrative of human settlement. They suggest that the far north was not a barrier, but a corridor, a pathway used during brief warm intervals when ice retreated and game followed the thaw into higher latitudes. One theory, long dismissed but now gaining traction, is the idea of a Beringen refuge. During the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered much of North America and Europe, a region of Alaska and Siberia remained ice-free, a cold, wind-swept landscape, but livable. Populations trapped there during the freeze may have adapted, survived, and eventually dispersed when the ice melted. Could some of those populations have moved further north, into the Arctic proper, into regions that, during warm phases, were far more hospitable than we imagine? The linguistic evidence is tantalizing. Proto-Indo-European, the ancestral language that gave rise to most European and many Asian languages, contains words for snow, ice, and cold weather animals, but also for concepts like eternal light and the land beyond the wind. Some scholars have speculated that the Indo-European homeland may have been further north than traditionally believed, perhaps in the Pontic-Caspian steppe or even beyond in the Arctic fringe during the Holocene optimum. If true, it would mean that the myth of Hyperborea is not Greek at all. It is older, deeper, a memory carried south by migrating peoples, preserved in fragments of language and story, encoded in the DNA of cultures that forgot their own origins. The pathways are still there, buried beneath tundra and ice, but the people who walked them left only whispers. In 1569, the Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator published a map of the world that would become the standard for navigation for centuries. But at the top of that map, in the blank space of the unexplored Arctic, he drew something strange. A massive polar continent, divided into 4 sections by rivers that flowed toward a central whirlpool at the exact North Pole. He called it *Septentrionalis*, the northern land. It was not based on observation. Mercator had never been to the Arctic. No European had. Yet he drew it with confidence, and he claimed his source was an ancient text, now lost. This was not fantasy. Mercator was a serious scholar, meticulous in his craft. If he included a polar continent, he believed he had reason to. But what was his source? Some suggest he relied on medieval Norse sagas, which spoke of lands beyond Greenland. Others point to the Zeno map of 1380, a controversial document that allegedly depicted islands and coastlines in the far north, some of which match real places, and some of which have never been found. And then there is the Piri-Reis map of 1513, created by an Ottoman admiral. It shows the coastlines of South America and, controversially, what some claim is an ice-free Antarctica. The map was based, Piri-Reis himself wrote, on older charts, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. Could ancient seafarers have possessed knowledge of polar geography that we have since lost? Could there have been maps passed down through the centuries that recorded coastlines as they existed during warmer periods, when ice had not yet claimed the far north? Mainstream historians are skeptical. The anomalies in these maps, they argue, are the result of errors, speculation, and the distortion inherent in early cartographic projection. There is no evidence of ancient Antarctic exploration, no proof of lost charts depicting a temperate Arctic, but the maps exist. And their details, however distorted, suggest that someone, at some point, knew more about the polar regions than they should have. Mercator's polar continent was erased from maps within a century, dismissed as myth once explorers ventured far enough north to confirm its absence. But the question remains, where did the idea come from? Was it pure imagination? Or was it a memory, garbled by time, of a northern land that once existed, not as Mercator drew it, but as something older, stranger, and now hidden beneath the ice? The maps have been redrawn, but the mystery endures. In medieval legend, there stood at the North Pole a mountain of black stone, so massive, so dense, that it pulled compass needles toward it, disrupting navigation and drawing ships to their doom. They called it *Rupes Nigra*, the Black Rock. It appeared on maps for centuries, a fixture of polar geography long before anyone had actually seen the pole. Some maps depicted it surrounded by a ring of whirlpools. Others showed it crowned with ice, a dark pillar rising from the frozen sea. The legend was not entirely baseless. Sailors had long noticed that compasses behaved strangely as they sailed north. The closer they came to the pole, the more erratic the needle became, swinging wildly, pointing in directions that made no sense, sometimes ceasing to function altogether. We now know this is due to the nature of Earth's magnetic field. The magnetic North Pole does not align with the geographic North Pole. It wanders, drifting across the Arctic at a rate of several miles per year. In ancient times, without an understanding of magnetism, this phenomenon must have seemed supernatural, evidence of some great, invisible force emanating from the pole itself. The Black Rock became the mythic explanation. A mountain of lodestone, they reasoned, pulling iron and steel toward it. A place where the normal rules of the world did not apply. But here is the strange part. In 1831, explorer James Clark Ross located the magnetic North Pole, not at the geographic pole, but in the Canadian Arctic. And when he arrived, he found something unexpected, a region of intense magnetic distortion, unlike anything experienced elsewhere on Earth. Compasses didn't just point incorrectly. They spun, wobbled, and in some cases stopped working entirely. There was no mountain of lodestone, but the effect was real. Could the legend of Rupes Nigra have originated from early, undocumented encounters with the magnetic pole? Could ancient navigators, venturing further north than history records, have experienced this same distortion and returned with tales of a mountain that pulled the very stars from alignment? The Black Rock is gone from modern maps, but the idea persists, encoded in fantasy novels, role-playing games, and the lingering sense that the pole is not just a point on a map, but a threshold, a place where the world's hidden mechanics become visible. And perhaps, in that sense, the legend was always true. In 2013, a team of geologists analyzing satellite data over Greenland noticed something unusual. Beneath the ice sheet, buried under a mile of frozen water, there appeared to be structures, geometric anomalies that didn't match the natural topography of the bedrock. Valleys, yes. Mountains, yes. But also formations that resembled ridges, channels, and in one case, something that looked disturbingly like a circular depression, too regular to be a crater, too large to be natural erosion. The discovery was cautious. Scientists emphasized that what appeared to be structures could easily be geological features shaped by glacial movement, volcanic activity, or tectonic shifts. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And beneath a mile of ice, evidence is hard to come by. But the findings sparked renewed interest in a question that has haunted polar exploration for decades. What lies beneath? Greenland's ice is ancient, in some places more than 100,000 years old. Beneath it, the bedrock has been sealed off from the surface world for longer than human civilization has existed. If anything were built there, during a warmer period, during a Holocene optimum or earlier, it would be perfectly preserved, hidden in a frozen time capsule. And Greenland is not the only place. In Antarctica, ground-penetrating radar has revealed subglacial lakes, river systems, and mountain ranges that have been locked beneath ice for millions of years. In 2018, scientists discovered a massive impact crater beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in northwest Greenland, a meteorite strike that occurred sometime in the past, 100,000 years, but was only detected because the ice is finally beginning to thin. Each new scan, each new survey, reveals more of what has been hidden. And each revelation raises the same unsettling question. If we are only now discovering impact craters, lakes, and mountain ranges beneath the ice, what else might be down there? Mainstream science is cautious, as it should be. The leap from anomalous geological feature to ancient civilization is vast, unsupported by current evidence, and fraught with the risk of pseudoscience. But the data is real. The anomalies exist. And as climate change accelerates the melting of polar ice, more of the hidden world will be exposed. Perhaps in our lifetime, we will see what the Greeks could only imagine. Perhaps Hyperborea is not lost, only waiting. In 2005, on the remote island of Svalbard, high in the Arctic Ocean, scientists drilling into ancient rock uncovered something extraordinary: the fossilized remains of a tropical forest. Not tundra, not boreal pines. A forest of palms, ferns, and dawn redwoods, species that thrive in warm, humid climates. The fossils dated to the Paleocene epoch, roughly 56 million years ago, during a period known as the Paleocene-Ocene thermal maximum, when global temperatures spiked and the Arctic was not frozen, but lush. But you don't have to go back 56 million years to find a warm Arctic. You only have to go back 6,000. Sediment cores taken from lakes across the Canadian Arctic reveal pollen from spruce, birch, and alder, trees that today grow hundreds of miles further south. Fossil forests have been found in northern Greenland, preserved in permafrost, their wood still solid enough to burn. These are not Paleocene relics. These are trees that grew during the Holocene, within the span of recorded human history. Imagine standing at 80 degrees north latitude 6 millennia ago. The sun circles the sky without setting. A breeze carries the scent of pine and wildflowers. Birds nest in the low shrubs. Rivers flow, clear and cold, across valleys carpeted in green. It is still the Arctic. The winter will be dark, the cold punishing, but it is livable, survivable, perhaps even beautiful. This was the world that might have given rise to the myth of Hyperborea. Not a fantasy of endless summer, but a real place, made strange by latitude and light, where the sun's refusal to set could have seemed miraculous to travelers from the south. And here is the haunting part. We are living in a moment of return. As global temperatures rise, the Arctic is greening again. Satellite imagery shows vegetation spreading northward at an accelerating rate. Shrubs are growing where once there was only ice. Forests are creeping into tundra. The transformation is happening faster than at any point in recorded history. The Arctic is not becoming what it was, but it is becoming something. And as the ice recedes, as the land reveals itself once more, we may finally learn what has been hidden beneath the frozen silence. The forests are coming back, and with them, perhaps, the memory. What if the poles have not always been where they are now? This is not a fringe question. It is a matter of established science. Earth's axis wobbles. Its magnetic poles drift. And over geological time, the continents themselves move, shifting, colliding, tearing apart in this slow, relentless dance of plate tectonics. But there is a more radical idea, one that has been proposed, debated, and largely dismissed, yet refuses to disappear entirely. The theory of crustal displacement, sometimes called pole shift. The concept is simple. What if the Earth's crust, the thin rocky shell on which we live, could slip over the molten interior, like the skin of an orange sliding over the fruit beneath? Such a shift would not change the axis of rotation, but it would radically alter which parts of the planet sit at the poles. Land that was once temperate could find itself plunged into polar cold. Ice-covered regions could shift into warmer latitudes. Charles Hapgood, a historian and cartographer, championed this idea in the mid-20th century. He argued that periodic crustal shifts triggered by the uneven distribution of ice at the poles could explain rapid climate changes in the geological record, and perhaps even the sudden extinction of megafauna like the woolly mammoth flash-frozen with undigested food still in their stomachs. Mainstream geology has largely rejected Hapgood's theory. The mechanism he proposed doesn't align with our understanding of plate tectonics. The energy required for such a shift would be catastrophic and there is no evidence of such events in the recent geological record. But here is the question that won't go away. What if Hyperborea was not always in the Arctic? What if it was a real place, located at a more temperate latitude, that was displaced northward by some geological event, a crustal shift, a tectonic upheaval, or even the gradual drift of continents over millennia? What if the Greeks preserved a memory of that place, but misunderstood its location, assuming it was always in the north, when in fact it had moved there? It sounds like fantasy, but consider the Piri Reis map again. Consider the fossil forests. Consider the fact that Antarctica, now buried under ice, was once a temperate continent covered in forests, not millions of years ago, but within the span of time that humans have walked the earth. The poles are not fixed. They have never been. And if the Earth's surface can move, then so can the places we call home. Perhaps Hyperborea is not buried beneath the Arctic ice at all. Perhaps it is somewhere else entirely, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to recognize it. In 1999, two treasure hunters with a metal detector stumbled upon something astonishing in a field near Nebra, Germany. It was a disc, roughly a foot in diameter, made of bronze and inlaid with gold. The gold formed symbols: a circle, a crescent, a cluster of dots, and a long curved arc stretching across the edge. The object was ancient, later dated to around 1600 BCE, making it the oldest known depiction of the cosmos. At first, scholars were baffled. Was it ceremonial? Decorative? A piece of religious iconography? Then the astronomer Wolfhard Schlosser examined it more closely and realized what he was looking at: a map of the night sky. The cluster of dots represented the Pleiades. The circle was the full moon, the crescent, a new moon. But it was the arc that made the disk extraordinary. It spanned exactly 82 degrees, the precise angular distance the sun travels along the horizon between the summer and winter solstices, as seen from the latitude of Nebra. This was not symbolic. This was science. Functional astronomy, encoded in metal and gold 3,600 years ago by a Bronze Age people who were supposedly primitive. But here is where it becomes strange. The Nebra sky disk also contains a feature that should not be there: a representation of the solar barge, a mythological boat said to carry the sun across the sky. This motif appears in Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Norse mythology, but in Bronze Age Germany? Why? Some researchers have suggested that the disk is evidence of long-distance cultural exchange. At Bronze Age, Europeans were in contact with civilizations far to the south and east, sharing knowledge of astronomy, religion, and cosmology. Others see something else. They see a memory. The solar barge is a common motif in cultures that lived near water, rivers, seas, or coastlines where boats were central to life. But it also appears in the myths of the far north, where the sun's movement across the sky was not just observed, but venerated. The Norse, the Sami, the early Indo-Europeans all had myths of a sun that traveled in a celestial boat. What if the Nebra sky disk encodes knowledge that came from the north? What if the people who made it inherited astronomical understanding from a culture that lived closer to the pole, where the sun's behavior was more extreme, more sacred, more worthy of careful tracking? It is speculation, but the disk exists, and its precision speaks of a knowledge older and deeper than we have given the Bronze Age credit for. The sun moves, the stars turn, and in the gold of Nebra, someone remembered. In Norse mythology, the gods did not arise from the world. They came to it. The Aesir, Odin, Thor, Freya, were said to have descended from a place called Asgard, a realm located to the north of Midgard, the world of men. They brought with them knowledge, runes, magic, the secrets of metalworking and poetry. They were not born of the earth. They arrived. In Irish mythology, a similar story. The Tuatha De Danann, a race of godlike beings, arrived in Ireland from the Northern Isles, bringing with them 4 great treasures: a spear, a sword, a cauldron, and a stone. They were described as tall, luminous, skilled in arts that the native people did not possess. They ruled for a time, then vanished, retreating, the stories say, into the hollow hills. In Hindu tradition, the Vedic gods are said to have originated in a land called Aryavarta, Atara Kuru the northern land, a paradise where the sun shone without ceasing and where immortality was the birthright of its inhabitants. These are not isolated myths. They are echoes repeated across cultures, across continents, across millennia. Gods or godlike beings arriving from the north, bringing knowledge, teaching, then departing, leaving only stories. What if these myths are not theology, but history? What if, during the Holocene Optimum, there existed in the far north a culture more advanced, more organized, more sophisticated than its contemporaries, that sent emissaries southward? What if those emissaries, arriving in Bronze Age Europe, seemed like gods to the peoples they encountered? What if the knowledge they carried, astronomy, metallurgy, language, was remembered not as trade, but as divine gift? This is not a new idea. In the 19th century, scholars like Bal Gangadhar Tilak argued that the original homeland of the Indo-Europeans must have been in the Arctic, based on astronomical references in the Vedas that described prolonged periods of daylight. His theories were dismissed, but never entirely refuted. Modern genetics has complicated the picture. Indo-European origins are now traced to the Pontic-Caspian steppe, not the Arctic. But genetic ancestry and cultural memory are not the same thing. A people can carry stories from a place they no longer live. What if the gods of the north are not gods at all, but memories of people, real, mortal, extraordinary, who lived at the edge of the world and were mythologized by those who could not explain them? The stories remain. The gods have not left. They are still there, frozen in the amber of myth, waiting for us to remember them as human. 12,800 years ago, something changed. The Earth had been warming. The great ice sheets that covered North America and Europe were retreating. The climate was stabilizing. And then, suddenly, it wasn't. Temperatures plummeted. Glaciers that had been melting began to advance again. Ice returned to regions that had seen open water. The warming trend reversed, and the planet plunged back into near-glacial conditions. This event, known as the Younger Dryas, lasted for more than 1,000 years. What caused it is still debated. Some scientists point to a collapse in ocean circulation, triggered by the sudden influx of glacial meltwater. Others suggest a comet impact, a fragmented object striking the ice sheets, injecting enough dust and debris into the atmosphere to block the sun and trigger a rapid cooling. But whatever the cause, the effects were catastrophic. Across the northern hemisphere, ecosystems collapsed. Megafauna, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths went extinct. Human populations crashed. The archaeological record shows a dramatic reduction in settlement sites during this period. Entire cultures vanished. And in the far north, where the climate had briefly been livable, the ice returned. If there had been a Hyperborea, a culture living at high latitudes during the Holocene Optimum's early phase, Younger Dryas would have destroyed it. Not through war or disease, but through the simple, brutal return of winter. The sun would have dimmed. The rivers would have frozen. The forests would have died. And the people? They would have had two choices: migrate south or perish. Perhaps they migrated. Perhaps they carried with them the memory of a golden age, a time when the north was warm, when the sun circled endlessly, when life was possible at the top of the world. Perhaps that memory became myth, and perhaps that myth became Hyperborea. The Younger Dryas ended 11,700 years ago. The ice retreated again. The climate stabilized. But the world that emerged was not the same. Something had been lost. Something had been forgotten. And in the stories that survived, a shadow lingered, the memory of a place that existed before the cold returned. A paradise, yes, but a fragile one, the ice remembers. But it does not forgive. Deep in the oral traditions of the Sami people of northern Scandinavia, there exists a peculiar story. It speaks of a cave, hidden somewhere in the far north, where the sun never sets. Not metaphorically, literally. It is said that within this cave, light exists independent of the sky, a glow that emanates from the stone itself, warm and golden, like the first light of dawn frozen in time. The story is fragmented, passed down through generations, mixed with other tales of spirits and trickster gods. But the detail persists, a place underground where light endures. Anthropologists who have studied Sami mythology suggest the story may be a symbolic representation of the midnight sun, the months of continuous daylight experienced above the Arctic Circle. But the Sami themselves lived in the midnight sun. They did not need a myth to explain it. They experienced it every summer. So why the cave? One possibility: the story is a memory of a real place. Not a literal cave of light, but a geothermal feature, a volcanic vent, a hot spring, a fissure in the earth where heat and steam rise year-round, creating an oasis of warmth in the frozen landscape. Such places exist in Iceland, where geothermal activity keeps certain areas snow-free, even in the depths of winter. To ancient peoples, such a place might have seemed miraculous. Another possibility: the story is allegorical, representing not a physical location, but a state of being, a spiritual concept of enlightenment, of knowledge preserved, of something eternal that exists beyond the reach of the cold. Or perhaps it is both. Perhaps the Sami remembered a place, a real, tangible place that was later mythologized, elevated into metaphor, but never entirely forgotten. In 2012, a team of Norwegian geologists discovered a series of previously uncharted caves beneath the ice fields of Svalbard. The caves were formed by volcanic activity and contain year-round meltwater channels heated by geothermal energy. Inside, the temperature remains above freezing, even when the surface is locked in winter darkness. The discovery made headlines briefly, then faded from public consciousness. But those familiar with Sami legends noticed the parallel. A cave where warmth endures, where light, or at least the promise of it, never fully dies. Perhaps the myth was true all along. The 19th century was an age of lost worlds. Explorers sought Atlantis in the Mediterranean, El Dorado in the Amazon, and Shambhala in the Himalayas. And they sought Hyperborea in the Arctic. It began as scholarly curiosity. Theosophists like Helena Blavatsky claimed that Hyperborea was the birthplace of the root races of humanity, an advanced civilization that predated recorded history and seeded the cultures of the ancient world. Her writings were speculative, mystical, and largely unsupported by evidence, but they captured the imagination of a generation. Others took a more literal approach. In the early 20th century, explorers like Fridtjof Nansen and Roald Amundsen ventured into the polar regions not in search of myth, but in pursuit of geographical knowledge. Yet even they were not immune to the allure of Hyperborea. Nansen wrote of the Arctic's unearthly beauty and the sense that something ancient lingered in the ice. The fascination darkened in the 1930s. The Nazi regime, obsessed with racial purity and mythic origins, co-opted the Hyperborean legend, claiming it as the ancestral homeland of the Aryan race. Expeditions were funded. Theories were twisted to serve ideology. The myth was weaponized. By the mid-20th century, Hyperborea had become tainted, associated with pseudoscience, racism, and discredited occultism. Serious scholars avoided the topic. The myth was relegated to the fringes. But the fascination never died. In recent decades, freed from the shadow of ideology, a new generation of researchers has begun to re-examine the question, not as mystics or ideologues, but as scientists and archaeologists. They ask not, did Hyperborea exist as a paradise? But what real places, cultures, and climates might have inspired the myth? This is how myths should be approached, not as literal truth, but as distorted memory, as fragments of real experience, transformed by time and telling into something both more and less than history. Hyperborea may never be found in the way Atlantis enthusiasts dream of finding sunken columns and golden ruins. But it is being rediscovered in the data of ice cores, in the pollen records of ancient lakes, in the genetic history of Arctic peoples, and in the slow, steady revelation of what the far north once was and might become again. The myth endures because it speaks to something deeper than geography. It speaks to the human need to believe that paradise is not only possible, but was once real. And perhaps, in its own way, it was. The camera returns to where it began, the Arctic Ocean in midsummer, the sun hovering just above the horizon, neither rising nor setting, suspended in that strange, liminal space between day and night. The ice is melting, not slowly, not imperceptibly, but visibly, audibly, in groans and cracks that echo across the frozen expanse. The Arctic is changing. It is becoming something it has not been for thousands of years. And as it changes, it reveals. Coastlines appear where once there was only ice. Ancient riverbeds emerge. Forests long buried are exposed to the air for the first time in millennia. The past is surfacing. We may never know if Hyperborea existed as the Greeks imagined it, a land of immortals, untouched by time, basking in eternal light. But we know something existed. Something lived, thrived, and was forgotten. The Arctic was not always empty. It was home to the mammoth hunters of Yana River, to the unnamed peoples who left tools in the permafrost, to the cultures who sent gifts to Delos and were remembered as divine, to those who watched the midnight sun and understood, in ways we are only beginning to relearn, that the world is far older and stranger than history records. Hyperborea is not a place you can find on a map. It is a question, a possibility, a reminder that human memory is longer than we think, and that the world has forgotten more than it has remembered. Perhaps the real Hyperborea is not lost at all. Perhaps it is simply waiting beneath the ice, beneath the myths, beneath the layers of time, for us to be ready to see it. The sun circles, the ice retreats, and the story, as it always has, continues. If you've journeyed this far, consider sharing this exploration. Subscribe to witness the unfolding of more hidden histories. The past is not gone, it is only sleeping. And the North remembers.